It's actually 2 weeks ago. My biggest worry was that I was supposed to teach a class this morning, and I was supposed to do an orientation with the students, and I was worried about the traffic, about how I was going to get to one to the other. That was my big worry 2 weeks ago. So in the end, I didn't give that class, and in the end, the students didn't come. So yeah, we can worry. That itself is good. We can worry about all that we want, and then we realize we're worrying about the wrong things. So it wasn't so easy to prepare for the share this week. I don't know. It's hard to focus, and other things kept coming up, and sometimes life gets in the way. And I actually, at one point, there was one issue that I decided I wanted to discuss with somebody in terms of some of the theological issues involved. And I called up this fellow, and he's a professor in Bar Ilan, and then he said, "How are you thinking now? How do you have any bandwidth to be thinking?" And I said, I don't know. So let's begin. So this week, with the schedule, the way it works out, after Simchat Torah, I would have thought I had a whole week to prepare also. So that also did not work out exactly as we thought. So let's begin. I'm jumping into the third chapter, and I will we'll just begin. There's really one particular word that I want to focus on, which causes an incredible amount of problems. I just don't know if it's real or if it's artificial, but we'll see. But there's another part that is preliminary that we'll need to understand as well. Arum. The word arum is very interesting over here because the word arum was used in the previous verse, and that was to indicate sly or cunning. Sorry. Here it's sly or cunning, and in the last verse it was to indicate without clothing, that Adam and Eve were without clothing. Here, arum b'kol chayat hasadeh. So you have this really deliberate, and let's keep in mind that the divisions between the chapters are somewhat artificial. So we ended the last chapter with Adam and Eve being naked and not being embarrassed, that there was no sense of embarrassment at all. Now, that probably is more important than I'm giving, any kind of indication right now. One reason why there may have been no embarrassment is because there was no one else there. I mean, they had the whole garden to themselves. I don't know if you ever considered that, but there's no embarrassment whatsoever. Now, the thing that I want to focus on, which is very easy when you look at my sources, is the name Hashem Elokim. So, the first chapter was exclusively Elokim. The second chapter was all Hashem Elokim. So over here, this actually, the way that it's presented, continues from the second chapter. Vayomer el Isha, and this sly Nachash says to the woman, Af ki amar Elokim. Now notice, he just now deviated from Hashem Elokim. Hashem, of course, is Rachamim. Elokim is Midat Hadin. Now, I don't know if the Nachash knew that, but I know that, and therefore we're able to pay attention to this. Af ki amar Elokim lo tochlu mikol eit sagan. So part of what you need to pay attention to is by dropping the Hashem, the Midat HaRachamim, and only leaving it as Midat Hadin, he makes it sound like, look at these rules that are made up. Elokim said that you can't do anything. It's the sense of right. You can't eat kimar lo techlu mikol eit sagan, which means there is this law without any reason which is set up. Now, of course, there's a reason. By the way, the reason we've learned previously, and we'll go back to that soon, that when you eat it, you'll die. So that's not, that. By the way, could very well be midat harachamim. Midat harachamim says don't eat this thing which is dangerous for you. V'tomar isha lenachash mi priya eitz nochel. That we can eat from the trees of the field. Umi priha eitz asher b'toch hagan amar Elokim lo techlu minu v'lo tigu bo pen tumotun. And when it comes to the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden, Elokim said, don't eat it nor touch it lest you die. Now, I don't know if you realize how many problems there are. We'll read, if you want, one or two more verses, and then we'll go back. Vayomer Nachash, the serpent said, Lo motumutun, you're not going to die. Now the question, of course, is, so who's right? Did they die? Did they not die? So the answer is, well, it's not all that clear. But we'll see more. Ki yodea Elokim knows, ki biyomach lachem imet uvenivchu einechem, that when you eat it and your eyes open up, yitim ke Elohim yodea tov v'ra, you will be like God's knowing about good and evil. Now, one thing that I do want to stress over here is, has the Nachash said anything which isn't true until this point? Second thing I want you to pay attention to, or maybe we'll do this sequentially from the beginning. The shift between Hashem Elokim to Elokim, we noticed. Did you notice what's missing in this whole discussion? I'll help you. There's something missing that is not brought up whatsoever in this whole discussion. The tree of knowledge of good and evil was never mentioned. So now it could be that you think it's there, it's just not there. Rather, the back and forth was that the serpent says you can't eat from every tree of the field, mipri eitz hagan, and pasuk gimel, that's pasuk aleph, ki amar lukim lo tuchlu mikol eitz hagan, and vatomer yishai lachash mipri eitz hagan nochel. We can't eat from the fruits of the tree. By the way, second point, did God ever discuss the fruits of the tree? I know that you think that he did, but he didn't. It never said anything about the fruits. Only thing it said about was the tree. Of course, you're going to say to me, well, what does it mean you can't eat from the tree? Of course it means the fruits, but I'm just pointing out it wasn't there. Pasuk Priya eitz asher betoch hagan. Notice, it doesn't say which tree it is. It says the tree which is betoch hagan. So part of what we need to know is, what does the word betoch mean? So let's just look at the Targum for a moment. Targum in source number 2, Pasuk Gimel, Umi peri ilana, from the fruits of the tree, dimitziut ginta, the one in the middle of the garden, which is very interesting because the word betoch should be inside. Betoch hagan, in the gan. And he translates this as in the center of the gan, which seems to be a little awkward. Matter of fact, in just a couple of verses from here, we're told, if we'll keep on reading, Pasuk Vav, Vatera Isha ki tov ha'etz. Now we had tov all over the first chapter. God kept looking at things and saying, that's tov, that's tov, that's tov, till it was tov ma'od. Ki tov ha'etz lema'achal, v'chi ta'ava hu le'naim. The word ta'ava, by the way, is not a good one. V'nechmad ha'etz lahaskil, and it's pleasant in order to become educated. V'tikach mi peryo v'tochel, that she took from the fruit and shade, v'titin gam le'isha ima v'yochal, and then she gives to her man as well to eat. And one could interpret that as in a very negative way. She says, well, if I'm going to hell, I'll take him with me. Or it could be that she likes to share with her husband. So you could decide if this is being benevolent or if this is being cynical. Vatikpachna einei shneim, and both of their eyes opened up, and in v'yidu, and they knew, because presumably this is the eitz hadat tov v'ra. V'yidu ke'eru mimheim, and now they realized that they were in fact naked, which we were told at the end of the last chapter that they were naked. Of course, I can ask another question: does the knowledge that they're naked, is that tov or ra? Is that something good or is that something bad, or is that the combination of tov or ra? V'yitperu alei te'einav v'yisulam chagurot, and then they took fig leaves and they covered themselves up. V'yishmut kol Hashem Elokim. Notice, it's back to Hashem Elokim, which is the way that it was introduced. It was only in the narrative, in the discussion, the dialogue between the serpent and the woman, that only Elokim is noticed. V'yishmu et kol Hashem Elokim etalech began l'ruach hayam v'yitchabei ha'adam v'ishto mipnei Hashem Elokim bitoch ha'etz hagan, and they hid. Now the word bitoch is used again, so we can go back to source number 2 and again look at the Targum, and over here he uses a different word for bitoch, and he writes at the end, v'itmar is to hide, Adam v'itite, and his wife, min kadam Hashem Elokim bigoy ilan ginta, inside the garden, or the trees of the garden, which means over here you have the word betoch in 2 different verses in the same chapter, within a couple of verses of one another, and one time he's very specific about location, and one time it's very, very unspecific and just very general. Previously, in source number 3, we're told, Vayita Hashem Elokim. So again, notice, this is all chapter 2, as I said, is all Hashem Elokim, Gan Be'edim, Mikedem, Vayasem Sham, Et Adam Asher Yatzar, Vayitzmach Hashem Elokim, And again, Hashem Elokeinu min adama kol eitz nachmad l'mar'eh v'tov l'machal. By the way, that would really be interesting to compare what is said in the description of the tree with what the woman actually saw. Ve'etz hachayim b'toch hagan ve'etz hadat tov v'ra. Now, I hope you realize how awkward the second half of that verse was. The first part was, and God planted, the Lord God, if you will, planted, all of these trees, nachmad l'mer v'tov l'machal, pleasant to see and good for eating. Ve'etz hachayim b'toch hagan ve'etz hadat tov v'ra. So, which tree is described as being b'toch hagan? Presumably, it's the Eitz HaChaim is b'toch hagan. And then there is this afterthought, ve'etz hadat tov v'ra. And there is also this other tree, and that's this Eitz hadat tov v'ra. Now, I hope that you're all by this point sufficiently confused. Yes? Did you see why you should be confused now? Because the tree which is b'toch hagan and is in fact the Eitz HaChaim. So when it says over here that the woman says, which tree is she talking about? Pentamutun. Because the second part, or the last part, pentamutun, only applies to the Eitz hadat tov v'ra. Lo tigu, don't touch it, doesn't apply to either tree. By the way, not to eat from the fruits doesn't apply to any of them at all, as we'll see again in a moment. But first, this word over here, ve'etz hachayim b'toch hagan ve'etz hadat tov v'ra, here the Targum Onkelos again uses the word v'ilan chaya, and in source 4, and the tree of life, b'mitziut ginta, in the middle of the garden. So now you are now stuck with yet another problem. What was the location of the various trees? We're told in chapter 2 that the tree which is in the center of the garden is the Eitz HaChaim, and presumably that they sinned by eating from the Eitz hadat tov v'ra, which was in the center of the garden, which then leaves you with a little bit of a problem. So which one of them was in the center of the garden? And that's really where the confusion comes from. Now, I want to stress something. I'm not sure if the problem I just now said is real, or we just now somehow created it. And by the way, when I say we, it's me, and it's you, and it's Onkelos. Because Onkelos is to blame, at least a bit, because he used the word b'mitziut over here. It's in the middle. So therefore, according to Onkelos, there are two trees which are in the center. Of course, there could be confusion, because that's what happens when you eat from a tree of confusion, but you would have thought that the confusion only takes place after you eat from the tree, but we're a little bit ahead of ourselves, as you can see. And when you read that verse again, at the end of Pasuk Tet, ve'etz hachayim b'toch hagan ve'etz hadat tov v'ra, what is that ve'etz hadat tov v'ra? Does that mean that they're both in the center of the garden? What is that ve'etz hadat tov v'ra? What about it? I'll say it again. Ve'yitzmach Hashem Elokim min adama kol eitz nachmad l'rer v'tov l'machal ve'etz hachayim b'toch hagan ve'etz hadat tov v'ra. And again, what about it? Unless it's continuing from the previous phrase. And as I said, if you're confused, then wonderful. In source 5, it continues the narrative from chapter 2. God took man and he placed him in the garden to work it and to guard it. And here is the commandment, Lamor, saying, Lamor, by the way, means to communicate it. Lamor, say it over, which means he's telling him to tell it to Eve, who doesn't exist yet. Mikol eitz hagan ochal tuchlal, eat from every tree. Notice, no pri. The pri is not mentioned here. Ume'etz hadat tov v'ra lo tachlu mimenu. Don't partake of that tree, eitz hadat, at all. Ki biyom achlecha mimenu mot tumat. Because on the day that you eat it, you will die. By the way, that's what the serpent said. No, that's not true. Let's go back a second. What did she say? Back in source number 1. God said, that you'll die. And then says you won't die. By the way, he uses the word biyom in Pasuk Hey. Which God said you're going to die. He says no. On that day, your eyes will open up and you'll be like God's knowing tov v'ra, whatever that may mean. So we go back again to source number 5, and God says, and the day you eat it, you're going to die. Vayomer Hashem Elokim, once again, it's Hashem Elokim over here. Vayomer Hashem Elokim lo tov hayot hadam levado eselo ezu kenegdo. So, first I want to make an observation. We're going to skip a little bit, and then we'll work backwards. Reb Chaim Paltiel on source 14. He's apparently from among the Balei Tosfot. The Eitz HaChaim B'toch Hagan. So he's explaining the B'toch. The Im Tomer Manishtana Targum Shel Toch Zeh Mikol Toch HaKatuv B'Torah. Why is he different here when he describes Toch from every other place? And what he's trying to tell you is that every other place he doesn't say in the middle, b'mitziut, every other place he says bego, that it's inside, which means, again, does the word betoch mean inside, or does it mean in a very specific in the center? Now, I have no idea what he's talking about when he said this. I just found it interesting that he said it. And after I saw it, it stuck in my mind, and then I went and I checked, of course, every single betoch in the Chumash, and every single targum of the Onkelos in every single betoch. So if you just look at source number 6, and over here he says b'mitziut, just like he did in the other ones. By the way, you would have been led to believe by Rav Chaim Paltiel that it doesn't say that. In fact, till this point, most of the betochs are actually b'mitziut. You have in Perek Tet, where you have Noach rolling about betoch ohala. Here it's bego, inside the tent. Not the center of the tent, inside the tent. And I'm not going to try to figure all those out. Which certainly shouldn't mean in the very center, bigo, karta, in the city. Rashi nonetheless follows Onkelos and says betoch be'emtza. And I want again to stress, you should not have had to say this, except for perhaps one thing. Because again, Rashi clearly knows everything that I know here. But just to notice something, why it looks like Onkelos would have done this, at least in this case. We can try to figure out the other cases. Because over here it says, here I mean, where it's first introduced, source number 3, V'yitzmach Hashem Elokim min ha'adama, kol eitz nachmad l'mar v'tov l'machal, v'eitz ha'chayim b'toch hagan. So did it have to say b'toch hagan there? V'eitz ha'chayim, v'eitz ha'dat, tov ha'ra. I'm not sure if you needed the b'toch at all. I'm not sure if you needed the hagan at all. But I think that's what Onkelos, and certainly what Rashi's doing, is betoch be'emtza. What's it adding? It's not like the other cases where he went into the tent. Over here, of course, we're talking about the Garden of Eden. This is what God made in the Garden of Eden, so he made these trees as well. You could figure out if that's really correct or not, but that's what it seems to be. The Radak, in source number 13, tells us, the Eitz HaChaim b'toch hagan, the Eitz HaDat tov v'ra. B'toch kitargumo b'mitziut ginta. Toch means, just like the Targum says, in the center of the garden. V'hadavar yeh nishmar yoter be'emtza. Hamakom b'nei sha'advarim shehem sevivo yu kichomalo. And something in this very center is the most protected, because everything else can be like a wall to protect it. V'davar chaviv v'nahav l'adam yasimu b'toch ha'advarim ha'achirim k'dei shiyu lo choma u'mishmeret. So you, of course, notice I'm not saying anything about what happened on Shabbat, talking about walls and protecting us and so on. But he says that it makes sense that it's in the center, and therefore everything around it protects it. Uperish eitz ha'chayim, shetzmiach gam eitz ha'chayim b'toch hagan, v'hu eitz ha'ya b'tiv'o l'chazek teva adam, ochel mimenu v'yichyeh zman rav me'od. Which is interesting, because what he says over here about the eitz ha'chayim, he doesn't say you'll live forever. He says that it has within it medicinal qualities. It's medicinal. It's not magical, it's medicinal, that it will cause somebody to live a long time. But if you go into, in terms of a more mystical understanding of it, then it has this other quality which would actually make a person live forever. I'm skipping a little bit within the Radak. And the two trees are next to one another. Now, why do you have to say they're next to one another? Because each of them were described as being betoch. In chapter 2, you have the Eitz HaChaim described as being betoch, as Onkelos tells us, therefore it's be'emtza. And in chapter 3, when we talk about the tree that they ate from, which was clearly the sin, so that was described as betoch. So therefore he says, therefore the conclusion is that these two trees must have been very, very close in proximity to one another. Upirish shabotia yidiyah betov ubara, ohu chaser nismach upirisho hadat dat tov v'ra. So he's explaining a little bit, but it doesn't concern me that much right now, exactly what the qualities of the tree of knowledge are. Rav Chaim Paltiel, who we started before, and he tells us, "Uman nishtana targum shel toch zemi kol tocha katuv b'Torah, va'od lefima shekatav pen yishlach yado v'lekach meitz chaim v'chochai la'olam." So just pause for a second now. What he's referring to, we'll come back to source 14 in a second, is at the end of the scene there, Pasuk Kav Bet, back in source 1, Vayomer Shem Elokim Heina Adam Hayakachad Mimenu Lodat Tov V'Ra, which, by the way, sounds very much with that which the Nachash said. And I just want to stress, we'll see more in the Ramban, hopefully soon, that the Nachash is pretty good in what he says. That he says that man will be like whatever this means, Mimenu Kachad Mimenu Lodat Tov V'Ra, V'ata Pen Yishlach Yado, lest man now outstretch his hand, V'lakach Gam Me'etz HaChaim, V'achal V'chai Lolam, and he'll eat from the tree of life, and then he'll live forever, which sounds very much that this tree has qualities. I don't care right now if it's medicinal, if it's natural, or if it's magical, but God is saying we have to get him out of the garden because he's going to eat from that tree as well. So Rav Chaim Paltiel understands that, and he says over here that again, now this is a wonderful question which should bother every one of us, because, I don't know if Adam was Jewish or not. I don't know if he learned in yeshiva at all. I don't know if he had a Goyish cup or a Yiddish cup. Any single Jewish kid would have said, hold it, there's two trees. One, if you eat it, you'll die, and the other one, you'll live forever. So which one do you eat first? Right? Anybody who ever played Monopoly know what's going on over here. You get the get out of jail free card. You get the get out of jail free, and then you can do whatever you want afterwards. So it's the same thing over here. Which one do you take first? You eat from the Eitz HaChaim first. Then you go to the Eitz HaDat, and God can't do anything to you. And that's actually what he's playing with over here. Meaning, hold it. Shouldn't God have been concerned about this, that Adam was going to do it the other way around and eat from it first? And then he couldn't have been punished. V'tiritz Rabbeinu Sadia, the Kozman Shelo Chata Lo Hayamo Ilo Eitz HaChaim Rak L'Rapeh Michetz Mitah HaOchel MiEitz HaDat. That's unbelievable, Rav Sadia said. He said that the whole purpose of the Eitz HaChaim was as the antidote to the Eitz HaDat Tov V'Ra. If you ate from the Eitz HaChaim by itself, it wouldn't have done anything for you. It was the antidote if you ate the poison. Now, why would God create the antidote if he wants to give somebody punishment? I hope you understand where all this is going. According to Rav Sadia is telling us that something was missing over here. And it's actually the part I'm not going to go into in great depth, but I do want to explain it. Because the truth is, there's just a Dvar Torah by itself. You can just use this by yourself. What's he really saying here? That had Adam eaten from the Eitz HaDat Tov V'Ra, and then God confronts him and says, what happened? And Adam would have said then, I am so profoundly sorry. I messed up, we did the wrong thing, and we're sorry. Presumably God would have plucked off an apple or whatever it was from the Eitz HaChaim and said, here, take a bite of this is the antidote, and then now you can live again forever. Which means this tension between the two, the way Rav Sadia plays it, is fascinating because the problem is just so profound the other way. Because any person with any kind of sense, of course, you could tell me before you eat from the Eitz HaDat Tov V'Ra, maybe you don't have any sense, which itself is a whole other question. What is the difference between man before versus after eating from this, which is something the Rambam and the Moreh Nevuchim goes into. The Sforno speaks about this a lot as well. But over here, we have a really interesting dynamic according to Rav Sadia. Eating from the Eitz HaDat beforehand, eating from the Eitz HaChaim beforehand would have had no impact whatsoever. The only thing it was there for was an antidote after a person already ate from the Eitz HaDat Tov V'Ra, presumably only to help if Adam would have done tshuva. Mashal l'mashkei harofim shemarp'im adam micholaim u'lavriyam einu mo'il lahem l'chiot yoter. V'od yesh lomar, and you can say a second thing as well. The Eitz HaDat hayamakifet kol Eitz HaChaim. That the Eitz HaDat surrounded the Eitz HaChaim. By the way, we're back to the problem of Betoch. That they're both in the center, but the Eitz HaChaim is in the epicenter, and the Eitz HaDat surrounds it. As it says in the center of the field, v'lo began kishar toch, and not begun like every other toch, right? That's because he insisted that from the beginning. Essentially, what he's claiming is that till he eats from the Eitz Hadat, he had no access to the Eitz HaChaim, and it's only now, that's what that verse means. Oh, now perhaps he'll eat from the Eitz HaChaim, is because now he had access, but beforehand there was no access. But at very least, Rabbeinu Chaim Paltiel is interesting because he is trying to figure out the location of these two trees. The Ramban is going to go in a similar path. Right, which is what I had suggested before. It's a well-known place. The specific place. All this really goes according to Rashi. Which goes back to they're both described as betoch. That imagine two trees that then are surrounded by some kind of a little protection, like a little shrub perhaps protects the two. Ki emtza hadak kvar amru she'en yodea bo amitot hanaguda bilti Hashem levado. Which means this idea of which is you have a real big garden, it's the Garden of Eden. Two trees are in the middle. What's the precise middle? We don't know. Only God knows. Ve'etz ha'chaim ilan peryo noten ba'ochlav chaim arukim. And the Eitz HaChaim gives you long life. Ve'etz hadat tov v'ra amru mefarshim ki yaprivu molid ta'avat ha'mishkal. Now, I'm not sure to what extent the Ramban may be doing something which is a little polemical over here. That was part of what I was trying to figure out before this year. Because he says there are those who explain that this gives sexual desire. And therefore they covered themselves up. By the way, you could have argued just as easily the other way around. If they would have been clothed and they unclothed, they say, you see, that creates desire. So, meaning, it's a great indication when you have two facts, but they're not necessarily saying, that's why it's a suggestion. Some say. And we'll skip a little. And he rejects this. Why? That's tovara. So it means the Ramban says what we intuited earlier is that the Nachash speaks the truth. What he said was correct. But then he writes, and this could have been bolded, Ki Adam hu oseh b'tivo masher oi lasot k'fi hatoladot kasher su shemayim v'kol tzavram. Polei emet shepolatam emet v'lo yishano tafkidam ve'ein lem b'maseim avosena u'prei lan hazeh haya lo molid haratzon v'chefetz sheyivcharu ochlav b'davar o b'hipucho l'tov u'l'ra u'l'chei nikra eitz hadat tov v'ra ki hadat yom v'loshano al haratzon. Which means it's eating this tree created the ability of doing things which are either good or bad. And again, this point about what the Eitz Hadat was, I don't want to get into so much. Just continue a little bit more. Because now, again, I'm saying again, he's rejecting this idea that the Eitz Hadat is one of sexuality. By the way, the easiest reason to say it is the next chapter says, V'adam yadat chava ishto. V'nei be'et hazot lo yaben adam v'ishto hamashkal l'ta'ava. So what he's saying is that till this point, Adam and Eve, and just keep something in mind. At the end of the last, he's going to mention it in a second. At the end of the last chapter, it says that Adam and Eve were naked and they weren't embarrassed at all. But before that, even it says Vayala basar achad and so on. So the Ramban is claiming that Adam and Eve, before eating from this, again according to this approach, they would have had relations, but purely for functional purposes of bringing children into the world. But there would not have been any reason, by the way, which you can even call sexual desire, or for that matter, romance. Ulechein hayu ha'ivarim kulam be'einayim kipanim v'yadayim v'lo yitbalshu b'hem. Therefore, this is just functional. Therefore, there was no embarrassment. V'ne'acharei achlu min ha'etz hayta biyado ha'bechira u'retzano lahara o lahativ bein lo or bein lacherim. That's when this Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, now you can do good, you can do bad. V'zeh midat elokit mitzad echad, and therefore they'll be like God. It is like God because God can do what we perceive as good or bad. V'ra'al adam biyotlo bo yetzer v'tava. And if I'm losing you here, it's fine because I'm getting to the point I really want to get to, and that again goes back to the connection between these two trees. So he continues and he writes. He didn't really explain what it would do. It's really interesting he says that. One second, do you notice that? Did God say that or did Eve say that? So the Ramban is claiming that what Eve said is exactly what God said, which is a little difficult because it's not what God said when we saw in chapter 2. So I hope that you're as confused as I am, because essentially, again, I want to make sure that we understand one another a little bit till this point. We have two trees. God tells specifically that the Eitz HaChaim is B'toch HaGan. Eve says specifically that the Eitz Hadat is B'toch HaGan. God says specifically which one not to eat from, while Eve doesn't tell us which is the one that we shouldn't be eating from, rather says the one which is B'toch HaGan, which is itself confusing. Where did that confusion come from? That's part of what bothers me. The relationship between these two trees is also really confusing. What we saw so far was one really interesting comment by Rav Sadia that the Eitz HaChaim was only functional after man sinned, and I'll say it again, that's a great Dvar Torah by itself, that God created man with the ability to sin, and God created the way to repair the sin immediately, and all we needed to do was to embrace that, and we would have fixed that sin. But what's the problem? The problem is that Adam could not admit that he was wrong. Once Adam couldn't admit that he was wrong, then God chases him out of the Garden of Eden. So that's pretty much where we're up to. Let's go back and now try to go a little bit further. Rabbeinu Bechaye, again, is trouble. And again, that's what I want to point out. Everything I'm talking about today is about this word betoch. And he's going to try to, get himself out of it. And soon we'll get to the real surprising ones. Be'etz HaChaim betoch hagan, bi'er katuv, be'etz HaChaim she'ah betoch hagan. Be'emtsa'uto mamash. It was in the very center, Eitz HaChaim. And by the way, that's what we were told back in chapter 2, Perek Bet. V'lo yasakein be'etz hadat, ki lo perush be'ezem hakom hayam min hagan. And Eitz Hadat, we weren't told where it is exactly. Amnam, mimash yizkir betoch hagan, but when it says betoch hagan, v'husham bein Eitz HaChaim v'al Eitz Hadat, but when it was described both of them as being betoch hagan, anu mevinim ki shneim hayu bevadai betoch hagan, and now we know both of them were betoch hagan. V'afal pi shem shnayim v'iev sher l'shneim not liot be'emtza mamash, even though both of them couldn't be exactly precisely in the middle, hayu b'kan lemata achad u'lemala shnayim. It sounds that what he's saying is that the two trees have one root and two different branches going into two different directions. That's what it sounded like to you? Hayu b'kan lemata echad u'lemala shnayim. Ki chavuran echad milamata v'olchim u'mitpardim lemala. U'v'chein yu shneim be'emtzo gud hagan mamash. And he's about to try to prove that point. Now, I hope that you're impressed with this, because what he just now told us is that the two trees were really one tree. How does he know the two trees are one tree? It's because it says betoch by both of them. Now, again, this could be somewhat disturbing to us, because the only difference between the two trees, one root but there are two different branches. Again, we can imagine going in two different directions, but essentially, nonetheless, we're talking about one tree. His proof for this is fascinating because he says it's not the only case that we see this phenomena. He continues and he tells us, take a look. Right after it starts talking about the rivers. It talks about 4 different rivers. All 4 come from the same place. Just like the 4 rivers can all come to the same point, so the trees and and just realize, he says at the end, just in case you think you just now understood anything, because he just explained a lot, he goes, no, everything is spiritual over here, and you didn't understand anything. Now that idea that the 2 trees may actually be the same, look at the Moshev Skenim of the Balei Tosfos in source 17. Now I don't know who this is. I have a suspicion, and we'll see that in the Torah soon. Katuv Bal HaMikra, she'etz hachayim ve'etz hadat einam ela etz echad. So again, we saw this with Bein B'chaye, and now, but this is earlier. We see that they're one tree. V'hu kamo she'omer al adam shehu ish chacham ve'ish tzadik v'kol echad. V'yiviu lezeh b'avor milat b'toch hagan she'enu מפרי העץ אשר בתוך הגן, ותרגום אונקלוס כמו כן במציאות. לא ייתכן את שניהם באמצע, כי אם היה אחד באמצע, ולא היה אחד. והנה הוא אחד ונקרא עץ הדת ועץ החיים. That one tree is called the עץ הדת and עץ החיים. ונקרא עץ הדת בבור שנתחדש לכם ידיעה בתשמיש. He goes back to this idea, going in terms of certain knowledge, like אדם ידעת חבישתו, וראיה לזה שמיד שלחו הפרי העץ הכירו, and then they noticed that they were naked. And what comes right after it says, Tevot v'tushtat shod. In the manuscript, they could not tell the next couple of words, so that's all that we have. The Torah goes in the same approach. But the Torah is going to do what I first did the first time I heard someone suggest this. I won't say the first time. This idea that there was one tree has been suggested, as you see, going all the way back to the Rishonim, going back to modern times. There are people, contemporaries, who've written it as well. And if you're good enough, you can sell it, and you can convince people even that that's the case. Oh, it says Batok by both of them, therefore it's the same tree. Now, I don't believe that that's really the case, that it's the same tree. I just want to say that very clearly. And the one who's actually going to tell us who said it is going to be the Torah. So just one thing about the Torah. The Torah is the son of the Rosh. The Torah, as we have it in our Chumash, is generally the Torah which has been Hakatzar. They cut out most of his commentary. Essentially, publishing books in the olden days and publishing books today is all about getting your market. So the more books you can claim are in your volume, the more sales you can do. The problem with the Torah, and by the way, there's lots of books like this, is that, I'll just say, for example, if you were to learn the Akedat Yitzchak and you were to learn the Abarbanel, you would likely be shocked to realize the amount of correlation between the two. Should I say it in a nice way? The Abarbanel rips off the Akedat Yitzchak. Not only does he rip him off, he doesn't even quote him. Every now and then he may say, oh yeah, by the way, word for word he takes from him. The Torah ripped off the Ramban. Now, they didn't see it that way. They saw it as actually doing something positive, as giving honor and so on. But they didn't always quote. I think there were different kind of ethics in terms of citations, kind of maybe like college students today, that you don't necessarily have to quote everything where you got it from. Anyway, the Torah, when they published it, they cut out almost his entire commentary, and all they left in, I'm saying for the most part, were cute gematria kind of things that a person would think that's all the Torah wrote. You can go and buy a book today, which is called the Torah, not HaKatzer, HaAruch. And you say, oh, what's the rest of it? Well, a lot of it's the Ramban, but there's lots of other really interesting things in it. And that was what the Torah looked like before the publishers cut it into little pieces. So now let's take a look at the Torah. And what do I say? And you'll notice here, HaTorah, HaAruch. the Torah in its original sense. Ve'etz hachaim b'toch hagan, pirish etz hachaim ya be'emtza hagan, u'makaro yadua, v'nodel yadei shmo shehu etz hachaim, v'alkein amar b'toch hagan, v'lo amar bigan, v'chein targum unkelos b'mitziut, ganta. So all this we've seen already. V'zel shushiva chaval l'nachash, v'priya etz asher b'toch hagan, and that's our problem. Why is Eve describing the other tree as b'toch? Amar l'kim lo tochlu meno shesher lo iskiru b'shmo. She never mentioned its name, and I said that from the beginning. When the sin takes place, the name Eitz Hadat is never used. Elakivan Shiskiru Makomo, once it said its place, Noda Mihu. It's only about the place, you know what it is. But you could just as easily, meaning I could make an argument right now that they never really ate from the Eitz Hachaim. Sorry, from the Eitz Hadat, they really ate from the Eitz Hachaim because it's described in B'toch Hagan. Because we don't know which tree they ate from. By the way, the biggest proof of that would be, just if I wanted to bother you, they didn't die. So maybe they ate from the wrong tree. Right? They're supposed to die. Maybe that's the proof they ate from the Eitz Hachaim. They lived a real long time. You like the way I just now did that? Probably not. But I hope it's more interesting than you thought. You didn't realize I was going there. How can they both be in the middle? Pirish Ramban, and that we've seen. By the way, I told you, he quotes the Ramban a lot. Right? And we saw all this in the Ramban. Right? It was a wide middle. And some say, and we saw that as well. That one was really in the middle, the other one surrounded it. Right? We saw that before. Sorry. Right? That was with Chaim Paltiel, if I'm not mistaken. Rav Yosef Kimchi, by the way, we haven't heard that name before. Rav Yosef Kimchi is the father of the Radak. Also, you'll now hopefully remember that that's where we started today, really. We started with the Radak. And the Radak said he followed Onkelos, and they're both in the middle. And it's really interesting here that the Radak does not quote his father, either to agree or to disagree. But I can presume that when he was a kid learning Chumash, he learned it not Chumash with Rashi. It could very well be that he learned Chumash with his father. And now let's look how the Torah quotes his father. He says, Rav Yosef Kimchi Pirish ha'etz hachaim ve'etz hadat ha'kol echad. So he's the one who suggests that they're both one tree. And now you realize what was being quoted before in the Moshe of Canaan was actually coming from Rav Yosef Kimchi. V'kol echad kach amar eitz hachaim haya b'toch hagan va'od haya eitz hadat tov u'ra. V'chein mashma mitzuvat ha'isha el ha'nachash mipri eitz hagan ochal nochal mipri eitz v'chulei. Harei shelo mana el eitz echad v'hu eitz hachaim ve'eitz hadat. They ate from both, which is very strange. I hope you understand. Ve'eni odeya mayaseh b'zeh pasuk, and now the Torah is saying, "I'll be nice." But he's really saying it's preposterous. He says, how can you say that? Because what do you do with the pasuk later on? Hein adam yachad menu. He's going to eat from the other one. Atay yishlach yado. Lefid verveu kvar achal mimenu. According to what he's saying, he already ate it. So, meaning, that was really my problem with this whole approach. To say that they're both the same tree, then why would God say, right, that was back in the first source, why would God say in Pasuk Kaf Bet, Vayomer Shem Elokim, Hein Adam Kachad Mimenu L'dat Tov V'Ra? They've already eaten from one tree. V'Tapen Yishlach Yado V'Lakach Gam Me'etz Hachaim V'Chal V'Chai La'Olam, and now eat from the other tree. Sounds pretty clear that God doesn't think it's the same tree. So this is fascinating to me, that you have God with one opinion, and you have Rabbi Yosef Kimchi with a different opinion. And I don't know exactly how you go about doing that, which is really what the Torah is saying, and he's saying it really in a nice way, much nicer than me. He's saying, I don't know, I know, I've heard that he said this, I don't know how it really fits in properly. So let's just pause till this point. What we now know is how confusing these two trees are. All of this comes, again, because of one word. because of the word betoch. But again, I want to remind you of the problem. The only one which God described as betoch was the Eitz HaChaim. Eve describes the other one, which now could bring up a whole other problem. How good was Eve's Mesorah? I mean, Eve wasn't precise when she said, and God said, if you touch it, you're going to die. That wasn't there. Which means there is a lack of imprecision over here. So why are we presuming that there's precision, therefore everything which it says is the same, and therefore and then the illogical conclusion of that is that there was only one tree. So again, that's essentially the problem that we have. And I'm just illustrating everything I've done till now to show us what happens when you eat from a tree of knowledge of good and evil, you get confused. And the commentaries, I'm sorry for this, seems to be completely confused on this by coming to all kinds of conclusions by something which isn't there. Why am I saying it isn't there? There is no clear statement about that they were both in the same place. Where did we get that from? Because they both said Betoch HaGan. What does Betoch HaGan mean? We're both inside the garden. Okay. That doesn't mean they were in precisely the same place. It's only because of Onkelos that Onkelos says that Betoch is Be'emtza. Oh, you can't have two Be'emtza. By the way, you can't have two Be'emtza. You can have two Be'emtza without even getting to the problem. By the way, this is a mathematical problem. It's not a theological problem. But you can get two things Be'emtza, depending where you're measuring from, how you're measuring, and without even having to say, we saw a couple of interesting things. There were two trees, but they had one root. Why? Because they needed, it's all of these commentaries were coming from the exact same place. And what place is this? Both of these trees are precisely in the middle, geographically, and now we have to figure out how that can be. So therefore, one conclusion is one root, two different branches. The other conclusion is, no, they're both the same tree. How can they be the same tree and have opposite effects on you? Which means, what is going on over here? So I'll say it again. All of this is born from the Targum, and all of this is insisting that they were both in the precise same place. And I'll say it again. Eve's entire description here is difficult, and I am so unconvinced that we should take this word betoch and use it with precision when everything else she says was imperfect or imprecise. Let me just try to show you what I mean by this. Yeah, we'll skip a little bit, and I'll show you when I was trying to figure this out. Okay? So, I have over here, you see, Perik Bed Pasuk Tet. So I put it in separate lines. Vayitzmach Hashem Elokim min adama kol eitz nachad limareh tov lemachal ve'etz hachayim betoch hagan ve'etz hadat tov v'ra. Right? And then later on, breaking it up, mikol ha'etz v'lo tig'u pentamutum Elokim. Right? Lo motumutum v'tirei yisha ki tov ha'etz lemachal v'kitavahu le'inayim v'nachman ha'etz laskil. Now, how similar is her description, or what she sees? Is that objective or subjective? How was the tree described itself? I know I've just confused you. It was kol eitz nachmad l'mareh v'tov l'machal. That's all the other trees. Or eitz nachmad l'mareh v'tov l'machal. Then and eitz hachayim b'toch hagan ve'etz hadat tov v'ra. And what is Eve? V'terei isha ki tov ha'etz l'machal v'ki tavahu le'inayim v'nechmad hu la'askil. Lahaskil, by the way, this is the only time it's used in the Chumash. V'nechmad is used twice. Tig'u, I checked every time that's used. You can look. It's interesting. It's used in terms of non-kosher animals in Vayikra Yud Aleph. It's used in terms of the sin of Korach. Don't touch anything. Again, inappropriate things to touch. It's used again with non-kosher animals in Dvarim, Yudalid. The word ta'ava is used. Ha'asafsuf fituvu ta'ava. Basar ki ta'avad l'nafshecha. And again, these, if you want one more time over there in Perik Yudalid in Dvarim, these are the only other time that these words are used. But it's interesting that generally these words are used of touching something which one is not allowed to touch. lo tig'u, when she says you can't even touch it, it's because it's contraband. It's because it's not kosher. It's because it's something which is not allowed. So it's very interesting, that extension which she makes. It's also interesting, the ta'ava, and you'll realize now, of course, that the ta'ava is going to be the counter force, which is going to end up overwhelming the understanding that you're not that this is contraband. I'll say this in a little easier way right now. Let's again, we're over here, so take a look. The Nachash says you can't eat from any tree, and she says no, we can eat them. Which means it's contraband. And the Nachash says you're not going to die, and he's right about that. Again, that word biyom, which is used about dying, that what's going to happen? Which, by the way, God seems to agree with later on. But now the problem is vatera isha kitova eitz l'ma'achal. Now this is the complete confusion, because all the other trees could have given a lot of these components, but once the ta'ava comes in, then essentially it's over. I want to go back now and look at the way that more modern commentators try to get to negotiate with these same problems which you had over here, and then hopefully we'll see something interesting. The question is, how many of them are we going to skip right now? Yeah, so we saw the Torah. Yeah, in source 19, the Netziv, the Eitz HaChaim b'toch hagam k'mashmo sheskulato lafoch tivei enoshi shehu l'shuv el afar k'muvar b'samoch. Man comes from the earth, just returns to the earth. But if you eat from the Eitz HaChaim, avami shocham be'Eitz HaChaim afilu ein ra'oi lo lakach harei hu chai la'olam. It's magic. It's not that it changes the name, it's magic. K'mo shemar Hashem, gam achar shochal adam mi'etz hadat, pen yishlach yado v'lakach gam mi'etz HaChaim v'chai la'olam. Which again is really the point. The Torah made the same point, that this is something which seems to be magical, even presumably, which sounds impossible against the will of God. And that can't be. I've overstated it. But God says, lest to eat from. What's the problem? God says, you're going to die. You're going to die. But nonetheless, it says, it seems very much. The Siv in source 20 will deal a little bit more about the location and the middle and so on. But let's look at Rav Hirsch and Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, because they're going to come in to a very similar place. B'yom acholcha mimenu motumat, pirsho kinira, titzchayev minafshecha, shrei lamito shel davar, lo metu bo b'yom. You'll be worthy of death, but they're not going to die right away, which is, by the way, is a problem. Ela nigzar aleim din mavet ka'onish ala avira. Rather, they received a sentence. Sometimes sentences take a while till they're fulfilled. V'chein, hamavet hu chida physiologit, it's a mystery. Shelo ba al pitrona ad hayom. The modern man, Rav Hirsch says, has still not been able to conquer over the understanding in terms of human physiology, in terms of the problem of death. Ukeshe tashuv ha'enoshut b'tshuva shlema al Hashem yivla gam hamavet min ha'olam. Uladat Chazal Yisrael re'uyim lekach kvar mishat matan Torah, which means that man in Gan Eden, now he's doing something totally different, was very similar to man who stood at Har Sinai. Ilu Shomra Torah, again, man was given a job there, though Dalu Shomra. Had man kept the Torah, Ilu Shomra Torah, B'chol Vavam, Achevshar Shegzer Mot Tumat, Nitkema Miyad. Anachnu Motzim Gam Makom Acher, Shagalutu Tachlif Ledin Mavet. Which is really interesting. Kach etzel Kain ve'etzel rotzech bishkaga hagalutu mavet bezi'ir anpin. He says is that and this is fascinating. He says that Adam's expulsion from Gan Eden, and later on, when Kain kills Hevel, and he then is chased away, and people are in galut today, in the words of Rav Hirsch, all of this is an aspect of death. Because that's kind of like death, and therefore that's part of what was included of when you eat this you will die. It means you'll be expelled from the Garden of Eden, which is a place of a different type of or eternal life. Leaving Gan Eden itself is death. Shekein gam hamavet eineno hashmada ela havara min olam hazeh, v'kach goliot adam migan Eden haya mavet bezir anpin hamitaka ledin hamavet. He says that's how God chose to give out that particular punishment. So again, I think it's fascinating. Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, who knew Rav Hirsch, and he talks about the relationship, he quotes Rav Hirsch, but he goes what I think is a little bit further, and he touches upon something which is really interesting, which I'll explain a little bit, and then we're going to wind down. בעובדה שהיה מטיל האדם בציווי אזהרה מיד עם תחילה פעילתו של זה, ניתן להכיר שעיקר ייעודו של האדם הוא לעשות רצון קונו. Why is man put on this earth? To do the will of God. ומסתבר שמאוחר יותר, היה השם מוסיף להטיל לאדם ציוויים וחובות נוספים. And as time goes on, God gives us more and more commandments. אבל הכוונה הייתה לחנך אדם לייעודו תחילה. God wanted to educate. ובציווי יחיד שהוטל עליו, in that singular rule, instruction that he gave man, היה צריך להוכיח את מידת ציווי להשם. אולם, מדוע זה עשה השם הליכה מעץ זה דווקא? Why that particular tree? ומה היה טיבו של עץ הזה? And what was really the nature of that tree? רוב הפרשנים החדשים, most of the modern commentaries, which is, he knows about the other ones that we've seen, most of the modern commentaries, וגם הרב שמשון פרל הירש ביניהם, מניח שלא היה זה מסגולותיו של העץ. It wasn't anything about the nature of the tree. שהאכילה מפיריו תבוא לידי דעת, that the tree itself, the fruits of this tree brings around knowledge, אלא העץ הפך לעץ הדעת טוב ורע רק עקב עזרת השם. והאווירה על עזרה זו מצד האדם. It's man rebelling and doing what God didn't say is what brings about the knowledge of good and evil. I'll say it again, the rebellion against God is the knowledge of good and evil and not anything to do with the fruit itself. ואם היה נקרא עץ הדת כפר בעת האזהרה, אין זה אלא על שם סופו. So, I'm going to use this in a second just to explain something which is a little bit bigger, but I want to make sure that we understand this. We like magic, that I guess is why Harry Potter sold so many books, which I haven't read any. We like to believe in these magical kinds of things. So therefore there were these two magical trees in the Garden of Eden. One magical tree gives knowledge, but it's a confusion of knowledge of good and evil. And the other one brings life. And God says that once you ate from that tree, you can't eat from this tree. But what Rav Hoffman just now said is that it wasn't the fruit of the tree that brought about that knowledge. It was man rebelling which brought about that knowledge. The rebellion of man is now I've entered to a place that I have not been before. Let me bring what may be a parallel discussion. I gave a shir years and years ago, and the topic of the shir was Chol of Yisrael. So everybody thought I was going to talk about Chol of Yisrael. But the topic actually was, can an infant Jewish child nurse from a non-Jewish woman, or is there a special thing about having Chol of Yisrael, and not Chol of Akum, right? So it's actually discussed in the Shulchan Aruch. Let me show you the source, because again, now that you've heard that, the Shulchan Aruch writes in source 25, Rama, Chalav Kutit Kechalav Yisrael. Right? They're both the same. No difference. Mikol Makom Lo Yinuk Tinok Min HaKutit. None shouldn't have milk from a non-Jewish woman. Im of Shar B'Yisraelit. The Chalav Kutit Mitamtem Halev. Now that's fascinating. There is this thing which is called Timtum Halev. So there's actually a machloket, an argument. It's really between the Rashba and I think the Maharals on the other side. What is it that causes Timtum Halev? So now, by the way, this idea then is going to be expanded to all kinds of non-kosher food. There's a fascinating tshuva of Chatam Sofer that explores this idea. He was asked about a kid who was somehow had some kind of developmental problem, but there was a particular hospital that knew how to deal with them, with children like this. But the hospital wasn't Jewish, and the food he would have been eating there would have been non-kosher food. So after writing a whole tshuva where he argues that it really, that for a person to get their intellect, right, is considered to be pikuach nefesh, he then writes, nonetheless, at the end, he thinks that it's a mistake because why is it worth getting your intellect back if you're going to destroy your soul at the same time? Now you just have to stop for a second. What is Timtum Halev? Does it come about because an individual sinned? Which means, is it the collateral damage that takes place by sinning? Or is it something which is magical? And of course the issue is going to be, what about a young child? A young child didn't sin. What about if somebody's sick? B'koach nefesh, they have to eat something. So you say, no, you can't eat it. It's Timtum Halev. It's going to bring about this Timtum Halev. So it's interesting because now if you go back to Rav Hirsch, or really more so Rav Hoffman, he's saying, no, the qualities didn't exist. It was quite the opposite. He seems to be lining up on that position that it is the experience of sin, the rebellion against God, which is, I'll use that term now, Timtum Halev, or if you want, you could say, no, it's not the Timtum Halev. It's this Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. What creates the confusion? It's the fact that you rebelled against God. Because once you rebelled against God, the world is different. Once you rebelled against God, now you know you could rebel against God. Which means over here, instead of saying, yes, it's the same tree, it's one tree, one root, two different branches and all, the issue isn't the tree. The issue is God declaring not to eat from that tree. Once God said not to eat from that tree, so now I can say, yes, there was something magical about that tree. I can say, no, there's nothing magical at all about the tree. The thing about that tree is that God said not to eat it. That's the damage. God says don't do it. That's the damage. On the other hand, what is this Eitz HaChaim? Again, according to this way, the Eitz HaChaim really shouldn't work by itself. And how can this Eitz HaChaim work? So I'll tell you. That's the problem that everybody seems to be having afterwards, because how in the world can you do something where then God no longer has agency? How is that even possible? How can God say, oh, he's going to do this and then he's going to be able to live forever? I'm saying that's actually the biggest problem in all of this. The biggest problem is at the end, okay, there's this other tree that you can eat from. I'm going to go back to what I said before. I absolutely love Rav Saadia Gaon, right, was Rav Saadia Gaon had said, is that it only works, and that was created for, to heal the sin and is part of the tshuva process. Which means essentially God is then saying, and again, a lot of the commentaries were saying there's a lot of deep things over here and there's a lot of metaphor being used over here, but essentially what it's saying is that you can't just go to the Eitz HaChaim, because exactly for the reason that I'm saying is difficult, because there's no magic over here. It's not a question of magic. What it is the question of, are you doing the will of God or not? So therefore, the individual who stopped doing the will of God, that's the eating of the tree of good. That is the achilah of the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, because now you have this confusion of Torah. Now you think you can do anything. Now you think that you're like God, which is exactly the point. You don't listen to God. You think that you're God now. You don't have to listen to God anymore. On the other hand, why was that other tree of life created? For the person to retract, for the person to back down, for the person to have humility, and the person to turn around, and especially when God confronts them, because that's exactly the issue. When God confronts you, do you now say, hold it, I am not God, and God is God, and I apologize, and I've done something wrong, and you backtrack everything you've done, and then the Eitz HaChaim is there in order to fix everything which had just now taken place. Which means essentially God is saying it doesn't work as magic, and you can't just go ahead and take it. And once you've entered this world of sin, now you go off into exile. And as we saw, maybe that exile, as I've first said, maybe that really is considered to be like death. Maybe God can punish us in any way that he chooses to interpret it. But the Eitz HaChaim at that point is not accessible, not because it's some magical thing, is that it only works in a particular type of a context, in a particular way of having accepted God after having made that mistake of entering into this world of good and evil. So essentially what I did is I gave two different shiurim today. I kind of connected the two of them together. But I gave two different shiurim. One of them was really centered around, no pun intended, of all of the Rishonim who were having difficulty with Onkelos, saying that this was the very center of the garden, and then trying to figure out what is the relationship between these two trees, versus more modern, certainly in terms of when they lived, but also in terms of thought, probably a little closer to where we are, looking at this in terms of, how exactly, perhaps psychologically, how religiously, how exactly does sin work? And as I said, it touches upon this issue of Timtum Shebelev as well, which we do see is an argument among the commentators, which means, is there some kind of magic involved in non-kosher which dulls the soul, or is it the result of sinning which dulls the soul? Which means that was the thing which was debated among the commentators, and that becomes really interesting when you go back now and read that into what took place in the Garden of Eden. I'm going to wrap up, and I very deliberately thought that we should learn. I think that learning is good, and I think it's Parsha Bereshit. We should learn Parsha Bereshit, and don't think ill of me that I didn't speak about what the situation which was going on. And I actually felt for the last hour the only time that I was completely calm for the last couple of days. So that itself has great value. And we can do all of our worrying other and on the side and constantly, and we suffered a very, very tragic and profoundly difficult experience on Shabbat, and maybe it gives us a little bit more insight to those who came before us, who went through pogroms and went through massacres and somehow picked themselves up, and we're only here today because they made the decision to continue on. I mean, we go back and look at the past about how we got to where we are today. We are descendants of survivors. It doesn't make a difference the Holocaust or not. We are descendants of survivors. There's survivors after survivors after survivors who made that conscious decision that we are going to continue. And that decision is what allowed us to be here today. So essentially, we are someplace between this commitment to the past and this commitment to the future, whereby we say, okay, they've done all kinds of horrific things, and you look at this, if anybody had any kind of a question, well, maybe Hamas is okay and maybe we're not okay. I think that the amount of clarity that we should have right now to realize how that is the most absurd statement in the world. We need to get it out a little bit better. We need to get it out, and we have a little bit of sympathy right now, but I wonder for how long the sympathy is going to last. But at least the truth that we have, and our soldiers are brave, and we pray that every one of them come back unharmed, and we pray that we're able to be completely victorious, and that we're able to follow the rules that God gave us, la'ovda u'l'shomra, which gets as basic as it is. And if we're able to do that, then maybe God will allow us to partake of that incredible tree that Eitz HaChaim. And ultimately we know that what is Eitz Chaim? Eitz Chaim hi lemachzikim ba, and the Torah is an Eitz Chaim, and that does give us life. And thank you for allowing me for the past hour to be involved in the Eitz Chaim, in the tree of life, which, as I said, gives us an incredible amount of nourishment. Bisarot tovot.